This evening, Chick Keller presents the first of our 3 talks related to the questions about Adam and Eve. The title of his talk is Scientific Constraints on the Existence of Adam and Eve. Here's a short bio on Chick. Chick went to Catholic schools through high school and then to St. Vincent Benedictine College and seminary and received a BA degree in philosophy. But he got disillusioned because the theologians seemed not to take the findings of science into consideration. He then received his BS degree in physics and mathematics, and then a PhD in astrophysics at Indiana University. His thesis involved computer models of pulsating stars. He then started working at LANL, starting in 1969. Of course, it wasn't called LANL then, LASL then, where it should be noted he had a very distinguished career as a staff member, a group leader, and eventually was director of IGPP, the Institute for Geophysics and Planetary Physics. Chick has read extensively about issues of faith and science. In applying science to faith, he has discovered that it often enhances our understanding of revelation, making faith stronger. Okay, well, let's get started. I'll turn it now over to Chick. Okay, so Chick, Susan, if you let Chick be in charge and then he can share his screen, I think we're all ready to go here. Yeah, there we go. Looks good. Yes. Oh, no, that's somebody else. Chick Keller started screen sharing. Okay, there you go. Okay, there it is. Great, Chick. I think you're ready to go.
One more thing. Okay, we're looking at, in this picture, we're looking at some carvings in the north transept of the cathedral at Chartres. And I've always loved these. Here is God thinking about Adam, planning Adam with his hands. And here he has actually made Adam to exist. And these two are side by side, very, very beautiful carvings. You've all known this one, but one of the things I will note about this is here's Eve. And you can see God has his arm around Eve because he's ready to hand her over. But she's looking very apprehensively at what does this all mean? I always like that painting from Michelangelo's on the Sistine Chapel. The biblical story of Adam and Eve has driven and charmed people through the ages, become a way to think about ourselves in many ways, subject to fanciful as well as serious thought. Not a day goes by without some aspect of this story being brought up. It's the subject of a number of telling cartoons which look at human frailty. As such, Adam and Eve are not only our spiritual parents, but also our intellectual and emotional parents, whether they existed or not. The problem. The biblical account of Genesis and our first parents has been accepted for millennia. Scientific studies, both of fossil record and genetic data, have suggested the human origins are more complicated than just simply two parents. Believers now have to attempt to bring these two views into account. Deborah and Lauren Harsma, who spoke at our summer session a few years ago, they have a book, Origins of Christian Perspectives, Creation, Evolution, Intelligence, Design. They make the following remark. Concerns about human origins drive much of the debate over creation, evolution, and design. So it's very important. Thus, human origins involve discussions of the fall, original sin, the nature of the soul. While these are important issues and thus good candidates for future discussions with our group, this presentation will be limited just to the origin of humanity and how science applies to biblical tradition. In short, we need to decide if these two people existed or not, as they say, and let the chips fall where they may, rather than decide a priori based on later theological thought that they must have existed. Why is this important? Does it change our concept of humanation? Yes, it does. If we are fallen, how do we view our actions? if we are not fallen, but just need to improve, is this a healthier idea of who we are? I'm going to make a few assumptions so that you know what kinds of things I'm talking about. When you read Genesis, as in many things in Genesis, there are two accounts. There were two accounts of Noah's Ark. There are two accounts of many things that happened, probably because the northern community of Judaism collapsed under attack, came south, brought their book with them, and probably Jeremiah or his people put the two books together and kept both sides. So the first account in Genesis seems to allow for many original humans. Then God said, let us make human beings in our image and likeness. He doesn't break anything more out. But the second account is the one that everybody goes to. There were no people prior to Adam, and the female came after that. Genesis 2.5, there was no man. Then God formed man out of the dust in the ground. I wish I hadn't done that. Assumption 2, the Garden of Eden was somewhere in Mesopotamia. Then God planted a garden in Eden in the east. Assumption 3, this all happened less than 10,000 years ago. Abel was a herder of flocks. Cain was a tiller of the ground. And these kinds of activities of herding and growing things didn't occur until 10,000, 8,000 years ago. Premise of this talk will be science can't tell us for certain what is, but it can definitely tell us what is not. Thus, in thinking about interpretations of biblical stories, science can help by ruling out certain ideas. In the case of Adam and Eve, if science shows that they could not have existed exactly as the Genesis account, then theologians need to consider other meanings freed from the literal interpretation. Adam and Eve as progenitor. Scientific constraints. These are some constraints. They have to have been Black Africans. That's interesting. If they originated 60,000 years ago, that's about when Adam started, would have named the animals, because we know from lots of art and everything else that the animals are already on walls and things and presumably had been named. But what if they occurred only all the way back to 200,000 years ago? That's a constraint that says, well, that's Homo sapiens. If they occurred before that, we have to include Neanderthals and Denisovians. From gene studies, these are the scientific constraints, they must have been part of a larger group, 6,000 to 10,000 individuals. But of course, the biblical chronology places them in a very different time frame. It has been generally recognized that there is a large gap between cognitive abilities of humans and other apes. Although this gap is more a continuum than a specific difference, we're finding out lots of things that bonobos and chimpanzees can think about and do. This gap seems so large that we're in a class by ourselves, and people say it's because we have spiritual souls. But this has not always been so. Some 50,000 years ago, there were up to 5 different species of Homo walking around the earth, all of whom seem to have had similar capabilities. The Neanderthals, humans, of course, Denisovians, Floresians, and 2 other smaller groups. The fossil record. We have a relatively rather continuous record of increasing brain size and abilities from fossils and the materials we see accompanying them. Homo sapiens seems to have originated from a combination of previous hominins, in particular Homo erectus and Heidelbergensis. Neanderthals seem to also have come from Heidelbergensis. The earliest records of Homo sapiens come from Africa, a whopping 300,000 years ago. By 200,000, they had spread throughout Africa, and they have now been found to have left Africa at least 125,000 years ago. Homo erectus has been found over most of Asia and Africa much earlier than Homo sapiens, and so there might have been some overlap there too. Homo sapiens descended from Heidelbergensis. Neanderthals split around 400,000 years. The two overlapped in Europe until about 50,000 years ago. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens shows up in Australia 65,000 years ago. Sapiens and Neanderthalensis interbred, and apparently the latter learned culture from the former just before their extinction. So they were capable of learning all this culture. And here's a rather dated, but a good idea of all the different skulls we find, the different kinds of things, a branch off to these robust people who went out. And then it doesn't say there's Heidelbergensis, and so we're sort of up there. If we look over here, about 2 million years ago, we start to see some kinds of stones. And then by 1 million years ago, we're seeing some very beautifully flaked work. Here's one person's idea of human evolution. If you look at Homo heidelbergensis, you can see that out of it probably came Denisovians, Neanderthal, Homo. There's a very strange thing of Homo and naledi. And here's Homo erectus, which went up to about 150,000 years ago and then died out. But you can also see that Homo sapiens, there were North Africans, East Africans, West, Central, North, and et cetera, et cetera. Another way to look at this is where they were as a function of dates. And you can see that they seem to have started from somewhere down here, Ethiopia, what have you, and then spread in different directions. Finally, we find them out here. There was a spread at 100 and some thousand years ago, but that may have died out. But then the big one is about 70,000 years ago. And they got all the way to Australia by 65,000 years ago. Well, they didn't get to North and South America until 15 or 16,000 years ago, but you can see them going into Europe, where they ran into the Neanderthals, and up in here where they ran into the Denisovians. If you look at the size of their brain, 400 cubic centimeters, 500, up to around 1,500 cubic centimeters, which is the size of our brains. The open circles are human beings. Little guys, little humans don't have such big brains because they're little. And then you can see this here, the Neanderthals, and they had brains about the same size. But you can see the technical cultural innovation sometime around the fact that we got really big brains is when everything took off in terms of the Metal Age and even musical notation and things like that. And you can see these very primitive skulls here up to things starting to look a lot like human beings. But the point is, this is a continuum. They just kept improving and improving and improving. In his recent book, The World Before Us, Tom Higgham discusses the amazing number of current explorations that continue to inform us about our ancestors. You would think there's just 2 or 3 or something like that. No, there must be 20 or 30 or 40 all over the world. And one of them, they found a bone from a cave. And when they did the DNA, they found out it was half Denisovian and half Neanderthal. They had lucked into an offspring, the first offspring of Neanderthal and Denisovians. You could only imagine what will be found in the next decade. The genetic record is a totally different thing. We talk about Adam and Eve, being 2 people. But if you study our DNA, we find out that Homo sapiens is a product of evolution. And I think it's interesting fact. We share the same DNA with 45% of our DNA, half of it we share with cauliflowers. Humans and chimpanzees and bonobos are almost all the same. Now our genes, however, can vary what they do. And these are called alleles, whether you have blue eyes or brown eyes or red hair, all different other kinds of things. But they also point out details of evolution. Dobronsky has put it in this particular situation. Since species differ in numerous genes, new genes can't arrive by mutation in a single individual born on a certain date at a certain place. Species arise gradually over the accumulation of gene differences, ultimately by the summation of many steps taking place in different geological locations at different times. Species arrive not as single individuals, but as diverging population, communities, races, occupy more or less extensive territories. Dennis Venema, who was also one of our speakers a few years ago, wrote a book, Adam and the Genome, Reading the Scripture Genetic Science, he and Scott McKnight. He points out that there are at least 4 different and relatively independent ways of showing that the human population was never less than 6,000 to 10,000 people. There are 4 ways. They can be divided into 2 categories: large genetic diversity and frequency of a thing called gene crossover. Large diversity in individual genes, mostly due to men, is seen in different alleles, requiring a very long time to have occurred, perhaps 1 million years. A single couple, such as Adam and Eve, could have had only a minute amount of this diversity, so there isn't time enough in the last 6,000 years or so for their progeny to produce the today's observed diversity. There are 2 different ways, and I'm not going to go into the 2 different ways. I'm just going to point out that you can look at, if you have a constant mutation rate, small human population of about 6,000 to 10,000 individuals about 75,000 years ago. So genetic diversity says there are lots of us. There's a thing called gene crossover switching. It's really interesting. At the fertilization, you have 2 strings of DNA, one from the mother, one from the father, and they hook up. Rarely, but constantly, some gene information hooks up the wrong way and crosses over. So some of the information from the mother gets in the father's part and the other way. That's another very complicated thing. But it turns out that the closer the genes are in that string, the less likely that there'll be a crossover. I don't know why that is, but that's what they found. If you look at the close genes that have not seen crossover, it indicates they're very old. And you can talk about when that might have happened and what the population would have been. And you get about the same answer from a very independent way of looking at it. Here's an example that gives you a feeling for that. Due primarily to population isolation, groups of people around the world, new words and different pronunciations creep in. When enough of these have done so, we have a new language. It's very different from its progenitor. New languages don't start off different. They evolve in populations. So it's the same kind of thing that people do. I thought this was a lot of fun. Pope evolution is real. Well, we had a good run. I love the snake here. What science won't allow. As stated above, science can't tell us what is in detail, but it can rule out alternatives. So science has told us what we can no longer hold. Adam and Eve, strictly understood by those assumptions I went to, didn't exist. Therefore, we need to look elsewhere for the important message of Genesis, because the story of Adam and Eve has incredibly important statements. In fact, one person said evolution has freed Genesis to tell its real story. What do you think? In view of this evidence, it's hard to find a place for a couple such as described in Genesis. There seem to be 2 alternatives. You can take the thing and say, Genesis is making important points, but it's not history. They didn't really exist, but the points that they make are really very important. Many people, though, have said, well, you know, let's stretch it a little bit and see if we can find a place in the actual development of humans for Adam and Eve. Proposed alternatives. A variety, nearly all place Adam and Eve in the larger population. Adam and Eve were 2 among many, but they received spiritual souls, only they did. And here we have a problem, because if just those 2 received spiritual souls, then they had to interbreed with people that didn't have spiritual souls. And that's sort of a funny thing. Also, the world is a very big place. And how were they able to influence human beings in the New World or in Australia, which were essentially isolated and you couldn't get there? Adam and Eve changed the way all humans think about God, and each of them then received spiritual soul until everybody had it. Similar problems with interbreeding and communication. Recently, there's a guy by the name of Swami Das, who is a very impressive guy, and he's written a novel about how to do this. And what he says is it's a genealogical Adam and Eve. And we'll go into that in a little bit. Harzma had 5 alternatives. Adam and Eve as recent ancestors. That's a strict interpretation of the Bible. Well, recent representatives. Well, they occurred then, but there are lots of other people, but they represented something far more important. Or a pair of ancient ancestors, way far back is when they started, or a group of ancient ancestors or ancient representatives. So they go through all these different things. And time won't let me go into all these, but you can see the kinds of things that they're trying to do to make Adam and Eve fit. All of these seem very strained. Nearly all require discarding some aspects of Genesis, place and a time for Adam and Eve not quite as described, into difficulties, especially impacted and influenced the rest. Big problem is how and when all humans could have gotten spiritual souls. And what about Neanderthals who were capable of symbolic thought and representation? Cave paintings in Stave have now been dated to time much earlier than Homo sapiens got there. Swami Das has the following reason. The biblical story of sin and redemption makes little sense without Adam and Eve. And he quotes these parts of Paul's epistles. The unity of the human race is rooted in Adam. Although we have sinned in the first Adam, God's son came down human flesh as the last Adam, and therefore astonishing, Jesus is Savior of us all. And again, some of the epistles. The biblical testimony supporting traditional monogenesis, namely Adam and Eve, is not easily set aside. So what did he do? He said a novel way is you separate Adam and Eve into the historical Adam and Eve that we've been just discussing and the genealogical Adam and Eve. Genealogical Adam and Eve, if you do the computer models and everything else, allows them to appear 6,000 years ago, and thus all humans have descended down to Christ, have descended and have them as ancestors. Now they have other ancestors and everything else, but they all have them as ancestors. Even there were thousands of people at that time, couple was specifically created with special spiritual attributes, and we're all descendants subject to their sin. Perhaps the biggest objection, as I said before, is how in the heck could you do? You can theoretically do it if you have a population that's all sort of homogeneous, they're all near each other. But how you get to Australia and Southern Africa and Western Hemisphere, those are things that didn't happen. You didn't have migrations that kept doing that. And so that's a really big objection to Swami Das. I'm going to tell you a story about the ill-fitting suit. Some of you may have heard it, but it makes a very important point. There was a very timid guy, and he went in to get a suit, and everybody at the haberdashery knew that he was very timid. And they had this suit that was really poorly made, but they thought they could foist it off on him. So they told him he looked good in it and sent him out. All his friends told him, that suit doesn't fit. Look, this sleeve's too short. Look, this is wrong. This is wrong. Go back and you complain to them. So he did. And they just looked at him and they said, oh, come on, it'll fit. Grab the cuff of this short sleeve and pull it down, right? Bend yourself over so that shoulder fits. Reach down and grab that long pants and pull it up. Doesn't that suit look good? Oh, okay, he says, and he walks out and he's hobbling down the street, holding the pants and holding the cuff and doing, and he passes a couple and the woman says, isn't it horrible how crippled up he is? And the man says, yeah, but don't that suit fit him well? Well, an awful lot of what we're doing in trying to explain Adam and Eve is, to me, doing things like this, trying to get the suit to fit well. What alternatives do we need to throw out? In attempting to fit Adam and Eve into the scientifically found chronology, several descriptions have to be displayed. Genesis is clear that Adam and Eve could not have existed much earlier than 6,000 years. This is from the genealogy, which you read in the New Testament, which requires early people, even though they lived to be 900 years old, some of them, from it saying, and also from Cain and Abel being farmers, no back in 10, farther back in it. Putting the farther back can't be done if we adhere to Genesis. Naming the animals, we can do the same thing. We can say, gee, they probably named the animals a lot longer ago than Adam did. Here's some pictures, gorgeous, beautiful pictures of lions in the Chauvet cave from 36,000 years ago. So these are a whole list of things in Genesis that we don't believe. We don't really think people live to be 100 years old. That bad angels bred with humans to produce giants. That building the Tower of Babel was really the source of languages. That Noah could have put all the earth's animals into the ark. That there is enough water to flood the entire earth. That the Garden Eden needed to have an angel to keep people out. Where's the angel now? Still keeping them out of the Garden Eden. The trees whose fruit could give you knowledge of good and evil. Where was that garden? Since we know humans arose in Africa, that women suddenly had pain in childbirth, that snakes didn't crawl on the ground until then. I mean, we have fossils of snakes from millions of years ago. So we don't believe these things. So if we don't believe these things, why do we hold so hard to Adam and Eve? I love this thing about the serpent. How does the serpent talk? That must have been miraculous. Why does Genesis pick a serpent? You know, people have always been afraid of snakes, and even though they're marvelous creatures, cursing the serpent to crawl on the ground. Well, all these pictures, you see a serpent, and before he gets cursed, he's still crawling on the ground. What was the serpent the devil? Genesis doesn't say. This is clearly an allegorical thing. If we have ceased to believe so many of the Genesis stories are precisely true, but rather missed to teach important truths, why should we hold so strong? If it were not for Christianity's attempt to explain humans' tendency to sin and the existence of evil, few of us would probably believe that Adam and Eve existed. We hang on to Adam and Eve because we want to figure out why all this other stuff happened. Might be an analogy with very large computers. This is my solution. Computers, especially if you're from Los Alamos, know they were dissolved, they were built and funded and everything else to have really huge computers to work on huge problems for defense. Other users got these computers, but they didn't use them for that. They just used them to, work on smaller problems. I was really faced with this in the Institute of Geophysics, where these faculty members would come and they had no idea how to run big things. We had to show them. So we showed them how to use these big computers, and they took off, and they're doing all kinds of great things now that the same machines that they weren't using before, now they know that they can use things. Similarly, Homo sapiens developed a huge brains capable of very complex thinking, but for some very special things for survival. Early humans maybe didn't recognize, and they just kept acting as their ancestors, but they were good at it. I like to think God walked in a garden with a couple, essentially told them, you can do a lot more with your brain. I gave you, including knowing good and evil. It didn't take long for all of this to spread through the human race. Thus, the observed great leap in culture forward about 50,000 years ago, when instead of doing acting like their ancestors, humans just began to do all sorts of new things. Well, that's one way to look at it. The evolutionary solution to the origins of humans encounters one large question. When did our ancestors become spiritual? When did they acquire a soul, which is commonly believed to be our spiritual part and in no way material? That's a tough question when you really look at it. A recent perspective, though, from this vantage point, one can immediately see that Adam emerged in history at that moment when a human being was first capable of forming even dimly thought of God. Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Benedict XVI, wrote, "The first thou, however stammering, said by human lips, marks the moment in which spirit arose in the world. Here the Rubicon of anthropogenesis was crossed." If this is true, then the theory of evolution neither invalidates or corroborates fate, but as Ratzinger acknowledges, it does, this is a quote from Ratzinger, it does challenge faith to understand itself more profoundly, and thus to help humans to understand themselves and become increasingly what they are, the being who is supposed to say thou to the God of eternity. So when would they have gotten that soul? When would they have said that first thou? We know that long before 6,000 years ago, humans understood religion and understood life after death from burials and all sorts of things. So when was that first thou? Well, at any rate, science has given a happy gift to revelation. Science gives us a slightly, but importantly different view of ourselves and our conditions. We are not fallen due to some sin. We are the result of the Creator's way of producing the people of God, which makes us still imperfectly adapted to responding to the transcendent, but able to improve with the saving grace of Christ. Conclusion: attempts to have Genesis and scientific findings agree run into a number of contradictions, problems requiring disbelief in part of Genesis. We're still faced with some conflict here, and we have to keep working on that. But science has given us a beautiful view of who we are, imperfect, but not fallen. Thanks very much. There's some suggested reading here. This is the book by the Harsmas. There's The World Before Us by Tom Higham. I really recommend reading that book. Adam, Eve, and the Genome is the book that Dennis Venema put out. And then there's some really interesting articles in the magazine Commonweal, Saving Adam, Evolution and Original Sin. Very thoughtful thing. And then there's Swami Das. You can get his book, or you can just go, just put Swami Das in to the website. You'll get as much as you ever wanted to see. There's lots of other things to read, but these will sort of put you in the perspective of the science and attempts to explain or come to deal with the science. Questions. We include scientific findings in our understanding of human. Should we include these findings in our understanding of Genesis? Are there ways around the conclusion of the scientific findings? Can we continue to cherish Genesis, which I do, account without believing it is historically accurate, but really a way of teaching important things? Does the scientific account make life a little less beautiful and full of meaning? Namely, we just sort of evolved, and it's not as wonderful and beautiful as that first carving that I showed you at the beginning of the talk of Adam in God's mind and then being created. Well, it's very likely that you can answer that by saying Adam was in God's mind. He just created him differently than we think. So that's it.
Okay. All right. Chick, maybe if you stop sharing your screen, then we can see everybody and see what people have to. I didn't see any questions in chat unless somebody just put one in there. No. Okay. Chick, where are you? Can you? Oh yeah, there you go. Okay. And now everybody can turn their screen on again if you want to be seen, and if you can wave your hand, maybe we can see where there are questions. I'm sure there are questions out there. Okay, and
or you can go to reactions and put a hand up in your screen, and that way we can make sure we get to everybody.
Okay.
We have a question from Don.
Walker Surfer.
Hi, Chick. No, I enjoyed your
Don.
talk, and I missed your other talks that you had in the series. But I guess my take on Adam and Eve in Genesis is it was written by the Israelites, probably 600-700 years BC in their Babylonian captivity. And in my mind, it was kind of a way to explain good and evil, how good and evil came into the world. I mean, if there's a good God, why is there evil? And so this Adam and Eve kind of gives a way for people of that time to have a way to grasp onto why evil came into the world. Mm-hmm. And why Paul and those people, the apostles, speak of Adam and Eve. Well, they didn't know any better. They believed exactly what the Old Testament was written as fact. And to me, we need to realize from what you said that it's a story that was written by people that know any better, but they wrote it to kind of give the idea of an all-loving God versus a good God and a bad God, which I think like the Babylonians believed in. And so I think we can't be too bound by the literal meaning of Genesis. I mean, it's still, that's my feeling, that we shouldn't try too hard to figure out, did Adam leave 60,000 years ago or this, or did God come walk with people in the garden? I don't believe any of that stuff. I think Adam and Eve were a way of explaining to the early Israelites how God loved man. He created man some way, how evil came into the world. And that's what I take from it.
We have a question or a comment from Gary. Let me read it. It says, Chick, you put a lot of weight on the significance of this spiritual soul exclusive to humans. Tell us the origins of the concept of spiritual soul. Is this a philosophical development? It is scriptural? What is it?
It is a subject for a talk I'm working on that I want to present probably in the fall. It is, there's a lot to it. Aristotle had the idea that everything had a form and a substance, and the form organized the substance. And so that's sort of a dualism that Aristotle had. And as the early Christians began to think about, are we more than just our hands and arms and feet? That fit very well into our thinking. And Plato had the idea of perfect forms that could, be the templates for the rest of us. And so Augustine used that one. Aquinas used the Aristotle one. The idea of a soul as a spiritual, a separate thing from a human body, you can't find that in the Old Testament. And it's alluded to a little bit in the New Testament, but not very much. And so the early church didn't really talk about that so much. That developed a little bit later, but especially with Augustine. And so you can certainly look at the whole thing and say, gee, there's something there. But more and more people are trying to deal with the fact that we shouldn't be a duality. We should be a unity. But if we are a unity, then what is the soul and how does it interact? Some people say, well, you need a soul to be able to be spiritual so that you can interact with spirits like God. But of course, what happens is in the Revelation is God just comes down and walks around as he did with Adam, with Abraham, or Jesus Christ, and talks to you. I mean, there isn't any spiritual interaction at all. It's just material. But it is the whole concept of a spiritual soul. And of course, the big question, there's 2 times you have to worry about when people, if you believe we have a spiritual soul, when you get it. When did Homo sapiens get the spiritual soul? And is that an analogy for when each baby growing or a young human being gets a spiritual soul? I was sort of tongue in cheek, but I was thinking maybe you don't get it until you need it. You only need it after you die. So you get it when you die. But there are lots of ways of looking at this. And however, at least in Catholicism and some other religions, Adam and Eve seem to be where we got our spiritual souls. And that runs into all those problems I pointed out.
So Chick, thanks a lot for that. Could I just follow up? So your point is that it was philosophical, and I accept that. I am also planning a talk. Maybe you and I could do a side-by-side again in the fall.
That'd be fun.
It would be.
Okay, we have a comment from Vicky. Much to think about. Other texts from the ancient Near East, i.e. Gilgamesh, contain human origin accounts, but do not focus on a positive relationship between humans and a deity, as do both accounts in Genesis. Comments?
I think that's one of the things that's so exciting about the Judeo-Christian tradition. they got rid of an awful lot of dualism. And the big dualism is there's an evil force and it's embodied by these gods, and a good force, and they're fighting all the time, and good doesn't always win. And so Vicky brings up a really interesting point. And that point is made by several people in recent books, that the Judeo-Christian tradition rewrote the whole idea of how to think about things. This is a loving God. This God wants the best for us. And it hurts God when we don't respond correctly. And so that is certainly different from all those other ones.
And Vicky has a follow-up note in the chat. She said, it's interesting to note that no creedal statement in Judaism, Christianity, or Islam mandates explicit belief in Adam and Eve. Ken Grime has a comment. Says, Chick, are the two stories of creation in Genesis complementary or contradictory, and why?
I think that's a really good question. Why would the one story just say, oh, well, let's make a whole bunch of humans, so we did it? The other one starts off with two people. But there's a very curious thing that happens in the second story. Cain kills Abel, and God tells him he's a bad guy, and and it's going to make him go off into the world. And Cain says, you have to help me here. Put a mark on me so that all those people out there won't kill me. Who are all those people out there? And so it's almost as if the writers thought that there were other people, but Adam and Eve were very, very special. And yet, on the other hand, it sounds like, no, they were the first two. And so I pointed out the first story because the first story can fit in with evolution just like that. But the second one can't. Good point.
And Carl has his hand raised. Carl, if you unmute yourself. There we go.
Okay, yes. Virtually every culture has an origin story. And once you start understanding that, it becomes clear that if you're a leader of a culture, you can't have no answer to the question of where did we come from and where are we going, and what are the rules of the game. So I think it's just another variation in the Judeo-Christian tradition that has an Adam and Eve, but Navajos have a mother that began everything, and the same is true for a variety of cultures. So to put some of the thoughts that you've had into a broader set of cultural phenomenon starts to, at least to me, to understand there's no way that a leader could have explained DNA and all that we know about evolution, a few hundred years ago, even 100 years ago. And so they had to make something up. And you get some really differences among the different cultures in terms of what's emphasized. With a number of Native American tribes, it's this concept of harmony is where we have to get with others. So I tend to look at the Adam and Eve story in that kind of context. There's one actually very smart Mormon theologist years ago who got tired of answering the question and just simply said, look, whenever God decided, he then said, okay, I've perfected the body enough. We'll now start injecting spirits which have been in existence forever in his thought. And that was the way he sort of brushed the topic aside. So that's all.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat. And I don't see any hands raised. Vicky, did you want to make a comment?
I did. Thank you for the point about the indigenous accounts. I think that would be fascinating, excuse me, to compare indigenous the world with Genesis accounts Buddhism cosmology, and when Buddha is monks, how did we get here? How did the world originate? So would it help you be a more mind? If not, then get off the question and basically discussion about the origin of the world or human origins, because you didn't see what applicability it had in terms of mindfulness practices. So there
Could
are,
everybody hear Vicky's question? It came through garbled for me.
Yeah, she was breaking up.
Vicky, would you mind repeating the last couple of sentences?
I'm talking about the point that Buddha's disciple origin of the world and human origins, and he said, knowing that would not make us better practitioners of Buddhist mindfulness. So get off the question.
Well, I guess my answer to that is, and I think that's a really good point. My answer to that is that Christianity in general assumes that Genesis is telling us why there is sin in the world. And a lot of the solutions come about, as Paul said, because one man sinned, one man had to redeem. And what he was essentially seems to have been saying was, we're all fallen. Our natures used to be wonderful and immortal and everything else, and now we've fallen and we can't really do very well. We keep messing up and keep doing bad things, and no matter how much we try, we still do it. So we're a fallen creature, and we have to reach out to God's grace and religion and everything else to help us. Science, as I said, gives us a wonderful gift, and it says, no, that's not why. The reason that you have a lot of these troubles is that you're a product of evolution. There are chemical things that drive you to do stuff. There's all kinds of things. And then, of course, your own culture, you've gotten very clever in terms of survival at doing really nasty things to other people. But it's not because you are fallen. You never were up there. You're just about as good as evolution could make you, and you can get better. And the way you get better is through Jesus Christ and grace, or if you're of some other religion, through Allah or Buddha. You can make yourself better. It's not impossible. It's not such a bad view of human nature. And so I don't think we should throw it away. I think that finding that we're a lot better than we thought and can get better if we work really hard is a wonderful view of human nature, which we don't often have in the past.
Thank you, Chick. Are there any other comments?
Just in past,
Vicky?
Christianity is the one that focuses on original sin and the fallen state of humanity. And although Judaism and Islam has a version, consider humanity to be fallen. We're more or less morally neutral on Adam and Eve to explain the existence of evil in the world within Christian nations of the Western religions.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? I don't see hands up. Go ahead and take yourself off mute if you want to ask a question at this point or make a comment. Maury's clapping. Okay, Eric, take yourself off mute.
Good job, Chick. Good job.
Just saying good job also.
Okay. Oh, the clapping, I see.
That's a clap.
Oh,
God,
that's-
All right, beautiful. Okay, we have a
Okay.
couple of more minutes, Dan.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, let me also just remind people that, Adam and Eve continues next week. I mean, Maury Pongrantz is going to continue the discussion, and he's going to talk about Christology without the fall, talking about the fall. And do we need Adam and Eve and the impact on Jesus's missions? And so we're going to continue this discussion again next week. And I hope most of you will be able to come back and join us again for this. And maybe you'll have thought up more questions to fire again at Chick. He'll be back next week and see what's going on here. And then, of course, following week, Gary Stradling is going to give us another version or another viewpoint on Adam and Eve. And so, this is just the first of 3 talks on the subject. So I hope everyone has a good rest of the week, and you'll be back here next week to hear us again. That's all I have to say.